Well, welcome to worship. Thank you for making it a point to be here. Always encouraging to me, and that's because you and your dedication. I want to invite you to open up to the book of Luke, and that's where we're going to be this evening, looking at Jesus. That's what we've been talking about this for the past couple of weeks, looking at Jesus. We've talked about looking at Jesus in the storm last week when life isn't right, at least the way that we want it to be. And we've talked about looking at Jesus when we find ourselves in sin, in the dregs of temptation, looking up to Jesus. And tonight, I want to direct your attention to another situation in which we need to look at Jesus, and that's when we are completely satisfied, when life is perfect, when we're on top of the mountains, right? We've talked about the valleys, we've talked about the chains, the gloomy darkness of prison and sin, but when life is peachy, right? When everything it seems to be going your way, when we are completely satisfied, in satisfaction looking at Jesus. So that's where we turn, and that's where we give our attention to the book of Luke. And first, the way that we're going to approach this is kind of like a case study. We're going to look at three different situations in Luke chapter 12, Luke chapter 18, and then Acts chapter 2, which is still Luke, right? But Acts chapter 2, looking at Jesus in the midst of satisfaction. So here in Luke chapter 12, this is a parable that you're probably familiar with, but this is the parable of the rich fool, as we know him more times than not, the rich fool. Let's start by reading this parable. Then we'll spend some time here, and then we'll move to a different passage. But here in Luke chapter 12, start in verse 13, okay? Someone in the crowd said to him, Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbiter but over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' Then in verse 21, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God." The rich fool. This is a case of someone that is selfish. Someone that is so consumed and wrapped up in themselves. When you, again, financially, he is completely satisfied. He finds himself, in fact, at a point in life where he can say to himself, "Hey, relax." That's satisfaction. Eat, drink, that's satisfaction, isn't it? He is at that point in life where he is completely satisfied, but he is so selfish. When you find yourself in that moment in satisfaction, this is one case that you can have. You can be so selfish and so wrapped up in yourself. Look at a few things that Jesus tells us. Contextual observations, if you will. Some things before we get into the parable, what Jesus tells us, some warnings. He says, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness." We know what it is to covet, right? To want something, to desire something that is, it's not yours. And you got no business coveting it. You've got no business yearning after it. We might call that the lust of the flesh or the lust of the eyes, right? That is covetousness. He says, be on your guard against all covetousness. This is the person who lacks satisfaction. They can't find satisfaction. The person that is always wanting and wanting and wanting, they can't find any satisfaction in any of those. So be on your guard against all covetousness. And look at the second one. He says, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. The abundance of possessions. You know what that screams? That this person has false satisfaction. For all covetousness, he lacks satisfaction. This person, he has all these possessions, and yet he's still not satisfied, right? You can have the latest and the best of everything, but that is not going to satisfy. In fact, that's not going to fill that God-shaped hole that you have in your soul, right? That can only be filled by God. This person lacks true satisfaction, and they're trying to fill that void with stuff. Just junk. Absolute junk. We were walking in Meyer 3 days ago or so. And again, kids embarrass the mess out of you. And there's nothing that you can do about it. But we were walking, and as we were walking in, getting the cart, some people were walking out. And one of our children, who's going to remain nameless, but has a birthday in a couple of days, said, why do those people have all that junk in their car? Out loud. I think we could probably ask ourselves, not about the cart, we could probably ask ourselves that about, let's open up the garage, right? Why do all those people have all that junk in the garage? Or why do all those people have all that junk in their house? Listen to me. All those possessions, they're not going to fill the God-shaped hole. That's false satisfaction. Why do we have all that junk? You ain't going to take it with you. But look at the parable. That's before we get into the parable. Look at what Jesus says in this parable. This man, he has zero concern, no concern for other people whatsoever. This guy is so selfish. In this parable, the warnings that he gives is that this guy has no concern for anyone else except himself. Follow me very carefully here. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns. And build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. Verse 19. And I will say to my soul, I ran out of fingers, but that's 6. 6 eyes. Now go back and read it again and look for the eyes. Verse 17, let's start again. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul. Now that's 5. Now we've got 2 or 3 sentences describing this guy. And you've got a combination of 11 my's and I's. My, oh my. That's a lot of eyes. Isn't that terrible? This guy is so consumed with himself that he has zero concern for anyone else who's good. Again, I get it. It's a parable. But do you ever find yourself like that? Do you find yourself wrapped up in the my's and the I's of life? Where you're constantly thinking to yourself, what do I need to do? Or what can you do for me? That's one of my pet peeves when we're talking about worship is these people that say, well, about worship or church or whatever it is. I just didn't feel it, or it didn't make me feel good, or they have nothing to offer me. Well, worship ain't about you. Worship's about God. And sometimes we need to step back and we need to realize that He's more important than we are. But look at this parable. He has no concern for others, and he also has little concern for the future, right? He said this in verse 19, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat and drink and be merry. You know what he never mentions in this parable? He never mentions anything about heaven, eternity, life beyond this, right? He was more concerned, this guy was more concerned with feeding his belly than feeding his soul, right? I mean, it's all about, look, I've got ample goods laid up for many years. Now, we'll look at it in a minute, but it doesn't say, and what it should say is, I have ample treasures laid up for all eternity. That's the goal. This guy is looking at the goods right now. No, that's not the spiritual concern, spiritually minded person. This guy is selfish. And this is one situation that we can find ourselves in when we face satisfaction, when we're on the mountains, when we have ample goods, when we have all these things and everything in life is going right. You can look at yours and you can be completely selfish. Let's look at another one. A few chapters later, still in the book of Luke, look at chapter 18. This is a case study of a guy who was a self-examiner. He looked introspectively. This is the story, as Luke records for us, about a ruler of the Jews who was wealthy, well off. Let's read it together, beginning in verse 18. And we're going to run through verse 25, actually. And the ruler asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother." And he said, "All these I have kept from my youth." When Jesus heard this, he said to him, "One thing you still lack. Sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me." But when he heard this in verse 23, but when he heard these things, he became very sad, for he was extremely rich. Jesus, seeing that he had become sad, said, "How difficult it is for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. For it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." This is the story. The first is a parable about a guy that he thought he had life made. This is a story about a guy that began to question, something's missing. When you arrive at that point in your satisfaction, in life, when everything's going and you're missing God, you ask yourself, what's left? This is Jesus' answer to this young man. Threefold, all in verse 22. The first is to give up. Go and distribute to the poor. Give up what you have. Sell your possessions. Take the proceeds of that and give it to the poor. Give up. I don't know what this guy thought when Jesus said, "Go and sell your possessions." But here's a true heartbreaking question. How many of us would be willing? I'm not asking us to do it. How many of us would be willing to sell our possessions? Go and sell your possessions. How many of us, if there was a fire at our house right now, maybe it's going, I hope it's not going on right now. But you get back home and you discover, I don't have a house anymore. What would you do? I think in reality, we are much more tied to our things than we want to ever admit. Go sell what you have, distribute it to the poor. Those words echo through all eternity, and they hit home even today, don't they? Would you be willing to even give up anything in order to follow Jesus? That's the first one that he says is give up. Give up what you have. And the second one follows immediately after that, because he's to distribute those to the poor, and that's to lay up, right? Lay up treasures in heaven. That's the commandment. As you give it to the poor, as you give it to those who are in need, you lay up treasures in heaven. The end of the parable that we just read back in chapter 12 it ends just that, like that. The one who is not rich towards God, the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. Rather, lay up treasure in heaven. And that's where Jesus says, moth and rust don't destroy, and thieves don't break in and steal. That's where our treasure ought to be. But this is the question of, as we think about as laying something up, this is the question of preparation. Are we prepared? Are we more prepared? I suppose an appropriate question in this regard is, are we more prepared for the stock market to come crashing down next week? Or are we more prepared for Jesus to come back next week? This guy was more prepared for the stock market to crash. He wasn't prepared to meet God. When we lay up treasures beyond this earth, we prepare our hearts and our souls for something that is beyond this earth. Hence this command, distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. The third one, come follow me. Follow up. All right? Step one, you've given up your treasure. Step two, you've stored it somewhere else. Step three, are you willing to follow through with it? This is the question of commitment. How truly committed are you to follow God? Knowing it and doing it are two different things. James chapter 4, verse 17 simply states the one who knows to do good and fails to do it, doesn't do it, it's sin. This guy Jesus encountered here, he knew the right thing to do. He knew what he needed to do in order to fill that void in his life, but he didn't do it. And I'm proposing that he walked away from that in a sinful state, because he knew the right thing to do and he failed to do it. Are you committed enough to follow through, to follow Jesus? Seriously, take a couple minutes. Examine yourself. Am I willing to give up all this junk? Would I be willing? If Jesus came back and asked me, would I be willing to sell it all so that I could spend time with him? It's a tough pill to swallow, isn't it? This guy was completely satisfied until he encountered Jesus. And then he wasn't. Let's turn to Luke's sequel in the book of Acts and look at another type of satisfaction, because here I believe we see it in Acts chapter 2. Still, we're floating on cloud 9. The first one was selfish in Luke chapter 12. The rich young ruler, he was a self-examiner. And here in Acts chapter 2, these guys are selfless. And they devoted themselves. This is beginning in verse 42 and going forwards to verse 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Satisfaction. These are people who were satisfied. In fact, it seems as we read this, it seems like there were a few people that were very well off. I would say that they are abundantly satisfied. But look at their satisfaction in this moment. Contextually, right, they have just given their life to Jesus. They've been baptized, and now they're still in Jerusalem, and they are enjoying fellowship, encouraging one another, and the church is growing leaps and bounds. They, in this situation, contrary to the parable about the rich fool, they looked to other people. They looked around and they saw that there were some people who didn't have anything. So what they did was they were selling their possessions. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing doesn't that sound familiar? And distributing the proceeds to all as any has need. They look to others. You know that first parable about the rich fool? You know, he was feeding his belly, right? I mean, he was looking out for the physical. These people here in this particular section, they're feeding their soul. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. They're feeding, they're feasting spiritually. This guy in the first parable, he was worried about what was going to come physically. These people are so spiritually minded. They're feeding their soul. Real quick, flip over to this passage in Colossians chapter 3. Let me read this to you. If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above. This is what they were doing. Seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things that are above, not on things that are on earth. This is the epitome of what was going on here in Acts chapter 2. Their minds are fixed on something that's going to last for all eternity. What a wonderful example for us. In stark contrast to the parable about the rich fool. In fact, this is a great example of exactly what they did, which is contrary to what caused the rich young ruler to walk away sorrowful. They gave up their possessions. They laid up their possessions for all eternity. And they followed up with Jesus, right? I mean, this is this is the church, isn't it? I mean, isn't this the example? If we could pick one out of what it means to be satisfied, they weren't satisfied in things. They were satisfied in God. I don't know if you've given much thought to what it would mean for all who had any land or possessions sold those and distributed that. But I've spent a lot of time in my life thinking about selling their lands. I don't know what it is about myself, or I know some others of you, but I grew up on a farm and I love that farm. In fact, ever since I was a little boy, about Amos's age, I told my parents, I'm going to build a house right there. And I had the spot picked out. My plan was to put it up next to the pond so that and this was at 7 years old, all right, so that I could always fish from my deck, right? I go home, and I don't know what it is, but it hurts my heart to go back to that farm. I love it. Spent so much time walking through those woods, so much time. I know all the trees. I don't have names for them. I don't know that I could ever sell it, especially to somebody that wasn't a part of the family, didn't appreciate it. What we have in Acts chapter 2 is, to me, one of the most moving stories of generosity. What are they selling? They're selling their land. But you think about this. From the Jewish perspective, their land, that land that they are selling, dates back thousands of years. They could trace their lineage from that land all the way back to Joshua. Can you imagine selling a piece of property that belonged to my great, 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 great grandfather? Let alone my grandmother's favorite necklace. It would be hard. But they find themselves so spiritually satisfied that they forget the physical. When you are in satisfaction. There's basically those three, in my estimation. You're basically in one of three camps. If you find yourself content, you can be so selfish and so self-consumed and wrapped up in the I's and the my's. Or you could look introspectively and think, you know what, something's missing. I need a different change. Or you could be like these people and find your contentment in God. Where do you stand? I hope your eyes are fixed on Jesus. If they're not, won't you fix them on him?